Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Well, happy Monday, everybody. Welcome back to Michael Brown Unplugged. Let's get started right now from stuff that was done over the weekend. CNN, they had Senator Chris Coons, who is Connecticut, I think. No, he's from Delaware. Chris Coons was on. And you may recall, if you didn't listen to the radio program, last week on the radio program, I talked about how Beto O'Rourke, when he was running for the United States Senate, in a radio interview, said very specifically that if you want to keep your AR-15, you should keep your AR-15, and you have a right to keep your AR-15. I don't know why AR-15s have to be such a big bugaboo with everybody, but apparently they are. Anyway, subsequent to that, Beto O'Rourke, in last week's debate on ABC News, Beto O'Rourke, when asked whether or not he was going to take away people's AR-15s, of course, he, whether he gets elected president or not, he has no authority to do that. They can try to impose an assault weapons ban, but I think that would probably be challenged in the Supreme Court fairly quickly. And the whole idea of banning a commonly used weapon, in this case the AR-15, is going to create such incredible backlash that I think it will hurt the Democrats for a long time. But Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, understands exactly what's going on. When he was asked whether or not the United States Senate was going to do anything, because this was a moment of opportunity, are you going to do anything like enact red flag laws? Are you going to do anything at all? Well, guess what? I don't think it's going to happen. Listen.
I really hope that our president will see this as an opportunity, a moment that calls for real leadership from him.
Real leadership for what? The real leadership, I am becoming more intractable every day in my position regarding the Second Amendment. I'm tired of emotions pushing this argument, and I'm tired of irrationality pushing this issue. The Second Amendment is there for a reason. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And quite frankly, I had somebody on Twitter, in fact, Dana Lash, who used to be a spokesperson for the NRA. Somebody was talking about, well, do you think you ought to be able to own a tank? And she pointed out that, well, yes, you can legally own a tank in the United States. And in fact, she points out that a friend of hers has a tank, lives at the end of the street. The kids like to play on it. And every Halloween, he fires it up and drives it up and down the street. Now, I don't know how he gets by with it, considering how much damage it might do to the streets. But yes, I'm almost to the point that it's time for us all to buy tanks.
The Republicans in the Senate have clearly indicated they're not willing to take one step forward if they don't have cover from the president. The House Democratic majority sent a bipartisan background check bill to us 6 months ago. We should take that up and vote on it. 93% of Americans, and that includes a majority of Republicans, a majority of gun owners, support strengthening background checks.
If I say to you, do you think we ought to have better background checks? Well, if you're like me, I would say no, because I think the background check system that we have now is pretty good. Do we need to be able to better share databases? Hell yeah, we ought to be able to better share databases, about people who have been convicted of felonies at the state level, whether that's shared with the feds or it's shared with other states. Of course we ought to be able to do that. But you know what? That's like saying that we ought to increase or improve interoperability of communications between police and fire departments of different jurisdictions based on what happened on 9/11. Well, here we are 18 years after 9/11, and we still haven't done that. So if I just ask a general question about, do you think we ought to increase or improve somehow or background checks? Well, I think everybody would say without thinking about it, well, yeah, if there's a way to make background checks more effective, then we ought to do that. That's not what they're talking about.
I have a bill with Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania that would say if you go into a gun store and you're a person prohibited by law from owning a gun, convicted felon, adjudicated mentally ill, and you lie on the background check form and try to buy a gun, state law enforcement should be promptly notified. That's
I'd have to go look at the forms that you currently fill out to do your background check, but I actually think you may already say that you affirm under penalty of perjury that everything that you put in there is correct. So if somebody wanted to prosecute you, you may be able to get you may be subject to prosecution already. I don't know, because it's been more than a year since I bought a gun, so I've obviously got to get off my butt and go buy another gun.
It's the sort of bill that has been embraced by folks, Republican and Democrat. I expect and hope it will be part of a White House package. I also think, to your question, Poppy, we may well see an emergency risk protection order proposal.
Can you imagine an emergency risk protection order at the federal level? Who's going to enforce that? The FBI does not have time to go do emergency risk protection orders, red flag laws. That's clearly a state matter. And that's where your due process is most protected, at the state level. And I'm opposed to red flag laws anyway. Call me a radical, but I am.
That's the sort of thing Rick Scott, Republican senator from Florida, signed into law as governor. We have one here in Delaware. I think we've got solutions in states like Delaware.
So what about...
I recently met with...
We are more than willing to give up due process. And I guarantee you that there are going to be cops that are going to get killed because of these red flag laws. Now, it's only anecdotal, but I read a story recently. I couldn't find a source. You know what? I couldn't find a source for it, so I'm not even going to describe it to you, other than an individual was killed when cops came barreling through the front door. The cops claimed that they announced themselves, but as I've often said, you know, if I'm on Ambien and I'm in a drug-induced stupor at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the cops are announcing who they are as they come through the door, I'm not certain I'm either going to comprehend what they're saying, because all I'm going to be hearing, think about what your brain hears. Your brain hears yelling and screaming and the crashing and the kicking in of your door. I'm not so sure that you're going to understand that it's cops. And then, are you supposed to believe that they're cops? You know what we're going to do? We're going to train thugs to break into people's homes and yell, "Law enforcement, cops, cops," you know, Douglas County Sheriff's Office, in hopes that the homeowners will retreat or put down their weapons, so then the thugs can kill you. Yeah, it's going to happen. There's no question in my mind it's going to happen.
With Moms Demand Action, a group that gave the most powerful and compelling testimonies about how having their own children in school going through active shooter drills in the first week of school breaks their hearts. As
if your school, if they spent time in the first week going through an active shooter drill, you're sending the wrong message to the kids. I'm not saying that schools shouldn't have active shooter drills, but if that is the very first thing you do at the beginning of school, you are instilling unnecessary fear in rugrats. And I think that's wrong.
As parents, as Americans, we have to do better at protecting our country.
And what about, Senator, what we heard from Congressman Beto O'Rourke last night? I'll quote him, "Hell yes, we are going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. Are you supportive of a mandatory buyback program for all of those weapons, all of those assault rifles on America's streets right now?
I am not. And I frankly think that that clip will be played for years at Second Amendment rallies with organizations that try to scare people by saying Democrats are coming for your guns. Okay. I'm a gun owner. My sons and I have gone skeet shooting and hunting, and frankly, I don't think having our presidential candidates like Congressman O'Rourke did say that we're going to try and take people's guns against their will is a wise either policy or political move.
Did he hurt the party? I hope so. But here's what everybody glosses over. Chris Coons says, I'm a gun owner. My sons and I have gone skeet shooting and hunting. And frankly, I don't think having our presidential candidates like Congressman O'Rourke did say that we're going to try to take people's guns against their will is wise either policy or a political move. I don't care about your skeet shooting. The Second Amendment is not about skeet shooting. I don't care about your hunting. That's not what the Second Amendment is about. And you know what they're trying to do? They're trying to buy legitimacy. Every time anybody talks about gun control and they say, well, I'm a gun owner and I just went skeet shooting and I go hunting with my family and my friends and I take my sons hunting. All they're trying to do is they're trying to buy legitimacy. I don't give a rat's ass about whether you've gone skeet shooting or hunting. And if you think that that's going to convince me, oh, you're a rational person about guns, no, it doesn't tell me at all that you're a rational person about guns. It tells me it is that proverbial, I don't know what happened, but, if you don't know what happened, then shut up. The minute you say, but, everybody should quit listening. I support guns. In fact, I'm a gun owner, and I go skeet shooting and I go hunting, but I don't care about your skeet shooting. I don't care about your hunting. But I will tell you this. Senator Coons is exactly right. I hope every Republican candidate, I hope every 527 committee, I hope every issues committee, I hope not just the NRA, but every Second Amendment organization takes what Beto O'Rourke said and they just play it incessantly and incessantly and incessantly to show you how far off we are in terms of the culture. Russian hockey goalkeeper Savaly Konovov was handed an AK-47 after inspiring his Ishta Ishkev, must be the name of his team, to a 3-2 victory against rival Shimei. Konovov was awarded the assault rifle by the captain, having been voted as player of the match by his teammates. This is the latest in a series of bizarre awards, according to the Daily Mail, of a bizarre awards handed out by hockey teams, with many NHL sides making it a custom. Netminder Savaly Konovov is given an AK-47 by his team captain, and the Daily Mail thinks that, well, this is getting kind of out of hand. What are we doing handing out AK-47s? Yeah, I happen to agree. It's no, I don't think it's getting out of hand. I just think it's nuts. Can you imagine? I think what I should do, I think I should start having contests on the terrestrial radio program, and for the prizes, I'll give away an AK-47 or maybe an AR-15. Wonder what they think about that, giving away an AR-15. Maybe I'll try it. Hang on, I'll be right back. I want to talk for a minute about social media. I know that I'm not quite as active as I need to be, and I've got a group that's helping me get more active on social media. And now that I'm back on terrestrial radio, we're going to get back, maybe doing Facebook and other stuff. But I want to talk about how liberals and their tactics against people on the right are beginning to backfire. Because the people who have made an industry out of destroying ordinary people's lives over, these really old social media posts and out of context comments, those very people are upset that it's now happening to them. The New York Times is clearly worried by the recent exposure of blatantly anti-Semitic tweets that was posted by one of its reporters. And the New York Times is clearly worried that even more embarrassing material might be out there. So they tried to stop the hemorrhaging with a rambling article demonizing independent journalists who uncovered those tweets. In fact, much of the liberal media sphere went into full panic mode, vehemently declaring that this particular exercise of the First Amendment is really an attack on the First Amendment. This is the Orwellian world that we now live in. The reason why liberal editors are so upset that independent conservative journalists are publishing evidence of the racist, anti-Semitic, and otherwise vile sentiments expressed by their supposedly objective, and I put the word objective in air quotes, employees comes down, as it usually does, to a simple message: power. Many journalists are in the profession not to inform the public. They're in the profession to gain the power to destroy people who question them, and they don't like those tactics being turned against them. Using journalistic techniques to target journalists and news organizations is fundamentally different from the well-established role of the news media in scrutinizing people in positions of power, according to the New York Times. In other words, they don't like the fact that well-established journalists or traditional journalists versus online journalists or new journalists, the freelancers, they don't like them doing that. Of course, that story was labeled news. It really should have been labeled opinion. So Arthur Schulzberger, who's the publisher of the New York Times, says this: the political operatives behind this campaign will argue that they are reporting on news organizations in the same way that news organizations report on elected officials and other public figures. But he roundly rejects that claim, insisting that his antagonists are trying to manipulate the facts for political gain. Okay, so let's take these freelancers out of the picture. What do you think Arthur Schulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, would think if I uncovered anti-Semitic tweets or homophobic or vile or other kind of racist tweets or comments on social media by a New York Times reporter, and I decided to talk about it on my radio program, or I decided to make screenshots of those and tweet those out, and suddenly they were to go viral? I'm not a journalist. Is he going to accuse me of somehow trying to pretend that I'm a journalist? No. If I find something, regardless of who says it, that I think is vile, homophobic, racist, transphobic, whatever else it might be, and I decide that I want to expose that individual because I think they're getting by with something, because I have a real issue with people who think they're getting by with something or who are being hypocritical about something. I think Arthur Schulzberger would say exactly the same thing about me. Now, to be objective, not everybody in the media is buying this. Eric Wemple of the Washington Post, Jack Schaefer of Politico, both wrote rebukes of the New York Times indignation. And neither one of these guys is a political operative, and neither one of them are certainly conservative by any means. But both of them found Schulzberger's statement both hypocritical and incongruent with the New York Times' own reporting on the story. Wemple wrote this: for decades now, representatives of the mainstream media have answered conservative critiques by imploring, judge us by the work we produce, not by the fact that more than 90% of us are liberal/democratic. Mainstreamers cannot have it both ways. Wow. Somebody finally pointing out the truth. The mainstream media is predominantly liberal, predominantly democratic. And when you have someone in the mainstream media pointing that out, I think it's worth all of us sitting up and taking notice. Now, considering that the New York Times recently, I think I talked about this, but I don't remember for sure. They had a staff meeting, and they were actually strategizing about how to undermine President Trump. Now, Schulzberger doesn't have much standing to complain about media bias when they actually had an editorial meeting to strategize about how to undermine Donald Trump. Now, I know this comes as a shock to many. Well, not really. I think what's shocking is that it became public because, I think that CNN probably has editorial meetings. The producers get together and they talk about which stories can they run that might have the most damage effect on President Trump. Not about what's an objective way to report this story, but instead, how can we present the story so that it looks like, or we can use it as, a way to attack Donald Trump. Yet the media outlets the New York Times is painting as victims used out-of-context video clips to claim that a group of teenage boys from a Catholic high school in Kentucky engaged in a racist attack on an innocent Native American Vietnam veteran. And you and I know that that story was a complete lie. It was fabricated by left-wing activists and circulated by some of the country's most so-called prestigious newspapers. Why did they do it? They did it because those teenagers were wearing Make America Great Again hats. And somehow in the sick, twisted minds of today's liberal journalists, that makes them and their families legitimate targets. Now, CNN, which the New York Times also portrays as a victim, went after an obscure social media user for making a meme of the president wrestling a figure with CNN's logo. The Daily Beast, obviously a left-wing outlet, once doxed a black forklift driver because he posted a meme about drunk Nancy Pelosi. And if I recall, I think that same meme got taken down by Twitter because it somehow violated their community standards. But you know who I think is most hypocritical of all? Huffington Post, the editor-in-chief, and an alumna of the New York Times, Lydia Palgreen. She called the prospect of journalists being held to the same standards as their targets extremely alarming. She argues hypocritically that this ought to worry anybody who cares about independent journalism, even though people now being attacked by the establishment are acting as independent journalists. This is, and I understand that journalists are all upset. The traditional journalists are all upset because now anybody with a microphone, anybody with a computer, anybody with the gumption to go out and actually do some research can come up with their own news stories. And they can offer those news stories to any number of conservative websites, or depending on how big of a social media following they have, they can simply go out and make that story go viral on their own without the use of any other media outlet. But in the mind of leftist journalists, destroying people's lives is somehow speaking truth to power and is somehow to be considered independent journalism. Well, let me tell you, it is not. It is a pure, shameless abuse of power by those who have it against those who don't have it. It's a deliberate exploitation of the far-left hate mobs that, well, quite frankly, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the big tech companies, YouTube, Google, that still allows to organize on social media, even as the tech giants ban conservative users for harassment when they criticize journalists. You can imagine that. You get banned because you're criticizing a journalist. But that's where we are in America. Back to the New York Times. Just recently, the Times complained to a professor's employer about a tweet referring to one of its high-profile columnists as a bedbug. Remember, I talked about this story maybe a week or two ago. The liberal media have made an art form out of digging up controversial tweets in order to attack ordinary Americans who support the president. And now that they've been given a dose of their own medicine, they've discovered they don't like the taste of that medicine. But you know what goes around comes around. And those who live by the social media gotcha game really shouldn't be surprised if the eventual undoing comes by the exact same means. In that regard, I love the idea that everybody, this is an example of how, in my opinion, as much as I hate big tech, and maybe I should rephrase that, because I do hate big tech, but I think this is a great example of how the internet has made the individual so much more powerful. I often talk about the kid in the garage or in the basement of his parents' home who's coming up with the next big thing. Well, the other thing that the internet has done, it has enabled people on their own to do their own research, fast, efficient, effective. And when they find things that they think are worthwhile, that they want their sphere of influence to know, they can log on to social media sites. And if they get lucky, if they're just lucky enough, it'll go viral. And the gotcha game gets played right back on mainstream media. Hang on, I'll be right back. I suppose I should just label this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged as Michael Brown attacks the New York Times incessantly. A friend of mine sent me an article about a FEMA official who has been indicted and arrested for corruption based on some illegal activities that she engaged in Puerto Rico. Here's how the New York Times tweeted the story out. They wrote an entire story, but here's their tweet. President Trump has repeatedly cast Puerto Rico's leaders as corrupt, but his own FEMA official overseeing the island's recovery after Hurricane Maria was arrested after being accused of taking bribes over a $1.8 billion deal. It was a $1.8 billion contract to restore power to Puerto Rico. Here's the story from the New York Times. A former top administrator of FEMA was arrested last Tuesday, in a major federal corruption investigation that found that the official took bribes from the president of a company that secured $1.8 billion in federal contracts to repair Puerto Rico's shredded electrical grid after Hurricane Maria. Federal authorities arrested Ahasha Tribble, FEMA's former deputy administrator for the region that includes Puerto Rico, and Donald Keith Ellison, the former president of Cobra Acquisitions, with whom Ms. Tribble had a, quote, close personal relationship, Rosa Emilia Rodriguez Velez, the United States Attorney for Puerto Rico, announced. They were accused of conspiring to defraud the federal government, among other charges. But here are the money paragraphs that are partly repeated in that New York Times tweet. President Trump has repeatedly cast Puerto Rico's leaders as incompetent and corrupt. Tuesday's arrest, however, did not involve any Puerto Ricans, but rather a longtime federal employee working on the island under the Trump administration. Ms. Tribble, who holds a doctorate in meteorology, was assigned to Puerto Rico for a year where she was the agency's energy sector lead. She was also a Homeland Security advisor during the Obama administration. Got it? She served in the Obama administration. Now, you might wonder how and when she might have gotten her start in government. Well, according to her, it appears that she began working as a technical officer for NOAA back in June of 2003 after finishing her doctoral degree. A couple of years later, she rose to the position of executive officer, which she held until June of 2008 when she became the chief of the Climate Services Division in the final 6 months of the Bush administration. Then she became a senior policy advisor at NOAA in 2009 during the early months of the Obama presidency before moving directly into the White House as Director of Critical Infrastructure Protection and Resilience Policy for the Department of Homeland Security. Since then, she's worked at the National Security Council, the Department of Energy, and finally at FEMA. Here's what everybody needs to understand. She's a career civil servant. It would have been difficult, if not impossible, for the Trump administration to fire her when they came into office in January of 2016. January 2017. The reason I know that is I had to fire a couple of civil servants, and it took me up to 2 years to do so. But more importantly, when the New York Times tries to tie her corruption to the Trump administration, they are deliberately ignoring the fact that she is a career civil servant with all of these civil service protections that keep her from being fired. Then there's another little secret I want you to know about. They name her, or they list her as the deputy administrator, the deputy regional administrator. Well, let me tell you how these deputy regional administrators work. You have the 10 FEMA regions. The regional administrator is almost always a political appointee. The deputy regional administrators, we used to call them directors, the deputy regional directors are almost always plucked from the civil service. The reason for that is you want continuity at the regional level from administration to administration. So she was a holdover from the Obama administration. Was she technically working for the Trump administration? Yes. Was she a Trump appointee? Absolutely not. But that's not what the New York Times wants people to believe. The New York Times wants people to believe Trump takes office, Trump appoints Tribble, Tribble ends up committing fraud in the execution and awarding of a contract. Therefore, Trump hires corrupt people. It's the exact opposite of what took place. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I don't like stories like this, particularly when it involves people at FEMA that have done nothing wrong. They're getting blamed. The regional administrators, they're not in charge of this. That kind of contracting, sure, that might sometimes, if somebody calls attention to a regional director, they might look at that contract. But if they're being told by the deputy regional administrator, who's a career civil servant, that yes, we've crossed all the T's, we've dotted all the I's, we've done everything properly, we put it out for bid, and this is an emergency deal, we've got to do this to get this stuff up and running, you have to rely upon them because they have the institutional knowledge. The New York Times, lying to its readers, absolutely lying to its readers. I know it doesn't come as a surprise to anybody that listens to this podcast, but I just want everyone to understand the New York Times. I take that back. The first story was about Senator Coons, but the past two stories are just examples of how corrupt the mainstream media is. Hey, thanks for listening to Michael Brown Unplugged. Be sure and download us on the iHeart app and on iTunes. And remember, you can now get the Michael Brown Show, the radio program, the terrestrial radio program. You can also get that on the iHeart app. So be sure and subscribe to Michael Brown's Heck of a Show on iTunes and the iHeart app. And be sure and follow me on social media. You can always find us on michaelbrowntoday.com. Across the bottom are all the social media icons. Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, they're all right there. Follow me, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.